The alarm screamed at 4:30 in the morning, and Maya Rodriguez slapped it silent before the sound could wake her daughter sleeping in the next room, the thin walls of their studio apartment doing little to muffle any noise, as she dragged herself from the sagging mattress that served as her bed and felt every hour of the 4 she'd managed to sleep pressing down on her like physical weight. She moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency, pulling on the same uniform she'd worn yesterday, because she hadn't had time to wash it after getting home at midnight from her second shift at the warehouse, the polyester fabric stiff with dried sweat, and the permanent smell of coffee and grease that no amount of detergent could eliminate. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman who looked a decade older than her 28 years, dark circles under her eyes like bruises, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days, but she didn't have time to dwell on appearances when she had exactly 45 minutes to get herself ready, pack Daniela's lunch and catch the first bus that would get her to Mel's diner before the morning rush hit at 6. The kitchen table was still covered with the bills she'd been sorting through last night, red letters screaming final notice and past due from every envelope. The medical bills from Daniela's emergency room visit last month stacked highest, nearly $3,000 that might as well have been $3 million for all the chance she had of paying it. Maya had done the math so many times she had it memorized. Her paycheck from the diner covered rent and groceries with maybe $50 left over. Her warehouse checks went to utilities and the minimum payments on her credit cards, and there was never anything left for emergencies or unexpected expenses or the insulin her mother needed, but couldn't afford even with Medicare. She grabbed 2 pieces of bread and made herself a dry sandwich because they were out of peanut butter, and payday wasn't until Friday, washing it down with tap water while she threw together Daniela's lunch, a cheese sandwich and an apple, and the last pack of juice boxes, mentally calculating whether she could make their groceries stretch another 3 days. The bus stop was 6 blocks away, and Maya walked it in the pre-dawn darkness, passing the closed storefronts and empty streets of a neighborhood that had seen better days, her sensible work shoes clicking against cracked pavement while she rehearsed the smile she'd need to wear for the next 8 hours straight. She'd been working at Mel's for 3 years now, ever since Robert left, and she'd found herself suddenly single with a 4-year-old and no college degree, taking whatever shifts Tommy the manager would give her because tips were better than hourly, and she couldn't afford to be picky. The other waitresses called her machine because she never stopped moving during her shifts, refilling coffee and taking orders and clearing tables with mechanical efficiency, her brain on autopilot while she calculated tips in her head and mentally scheduled the next 16 hours of her life. Today would be diner until 2, then she had exactly 45 minutes to pick up Daniela from her mother's apartment and drop her at the after-school program, then warehouse shift from 3 until 11 if they had overtime, which they usually did, then home to sleep for 4 hours before doing it all again. The bus arrived 7 minutes late, and Maya climbed aboard with the other early morning workers, housekeepers and construction workers and kitchen staff, all of them wearing the same expression of exhausted determination, the look of people who worked jobs that paid just enough to keep them trapped in the cycle of working those jobs. She found a seat near the back and closed her eyes, not sleeping but conserving energy, knowing that the moment she walked through those diner doors she'd need to be bright and cheerful and attentive, because her tips depended on her performance, and her performance determined whether Daniela ate next week. Mel's diner sat on the corner of 5th and Morrison, a relic from the 1950s with its chrome fixtures and red vinyl booths, and a neon sign that flickered on the letter M. The kind of place where the coffee was always hot and the pancakes were always slightly burned around the edges, and nobody bothered you if you wanted to sit for 3 hours, nursing a single cup. Maya pushed through the door at 5:53 and immediately tied on her apron, grabbing an order pad from the stack by the register, while Tommy grunted at her from behind the grill, his standard greeting that meant everything from hello to we're short-staffed today, to I need you to cover. Section 3. The morning regulars started filtering in right at 6. The construction workers who wanted breakfast before heading to their job sites, the nurses coming off night shift at the hospital down the street, the retired folks who came for the senior discount and the company, all of them settling into their usual spots with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd been following the same routine for years. Maya knew their orders by heart, knew that Bill wanted his eggs over easy with extra hot sauce, that Margaret took her oatmeal with brown sugar, and raisins on the side, that the Lopez brothers always split a Western omelette and argued about politics in rapid Spanish, and she moved between tables with practiced efficiency, coffee pot in one hand and order pad in the other. The one customer who always surprised her was Miss Chen, an elderly man who came in every Thursday morning at 7:15 and ordered the same thing, black coffee and whole wheat toast with butter, then sat in booth 7 reading the financial section of the newspaper for exactly 45 minutes. He was different from the other regulars in ways Maya couldn't quite articulate, something about the quality of his silence or the way he observed everything around him with quiet attention, always polite and soft-spoken and generous with his tips even though his tips were never extravagant. This Thursday morning followed the same pattern, Mr. Chen arriving precisely on time and settling into his booth with a slight nod in Maya's direction, and she brought him his coffee without being asked, the routine so established that words were unnecessary. She was refilling his cup when he looked up from his newspaper and actually studied her face, his expression concerned behind his wire-rimmed glasses, and asked in his gentle accented voice if she was feeling all right because she looked tired. Maya gave him her professional smile, the one that said everything was fine even when it wasn't, and assured him she was just working extra shifts to save up for something special, the lie coming easily after years of practice. Miss Chen nodded slowly, but his eyes suggested he didn't believe her, and he said something that caught her off guard, that she reminded him of his daughter, who had also worked very hard, past tense in a way that suggested a story Maya didn't feel comfortable asking about. The morning rush hit full force around 7:30, and Maya didn't have time to think about the strange conversation. She was too busy taking orders and delivering plates and diffusing the situation when Bobby's eggs came out scrambled instead of fried, moving through her section with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that hesitation cost you tips. Mr. Chen left at 8 o'clock exactly like he always did, and when Maya cleared his table she found a $20 bill under his coffee cup, 3 times what he owed for a $2 coffee and toast, with a paper napkin where he'd written in careful handwriting, "You work harder than anyone I know, take care of yourself." She stood there holding the napkin while customers called for refills and Tommy yelled that order 6 was up, and for the first time in months she felt something crack in the armor she'd built around herself, the constant performance of being fine when she was drowning. Maya folded the napkin and tucked it in her apron pocket, blinking back unexpected tears as she went back to work, and she didn't notice the man in the expensive suit who'd been watching her interaction with Mr. Chen from his seat at the counter. Marcus Ashworth III walked into Mel's diner at 8:15 with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no in his entire life. His $7,000 Tom Ford suit incongruous against the worn linoleum and flickering fluorescent lights, followed by 2 associates who looked equally out of place in their designer business casual. He'd suggested this location for their meeting specifically because it was the kind of place he'd never normally visit, the kind of authentic working-class establishment that his PR team kept trying to get him photographed at to improve his public image, and he surveyed the diner with barely concealed amusement like a tourist examining a particular quaint museum exhibit. The conversation at the counter died when they entered, the regular customers instinctively recognizing the presence of people who didn't belong, who came from a different world with different rules, and Tommy looked up from the grill with the expression of a man calculating whether the trouble would be worth the business. Marcus didn't wait to be seated, just strode directly to the booth in the back corner, the one with the best view of the entire diner, his associates scrambling to follow while he loudly complained into his phone about having to slum it in this neighborhood for appearances. Maya was clearing table 4 when she heard his voice carrying across the diner, that particular tone of entitled dismissiveness that wealthy people used when they wanted everyone to know they were wealthy, and she felt her stomach tighten with the familiar anxiety of knowing she'd have to serve someone who'd already decided she was beneath him. She grabbed menus and water glasses, and approached their booth with her professional smile fixed in place, the one that revealed nothing of what she was thinking, and asked in her cheerful waitress voice what she could get them this morning. Marcus barely glanced at her before launching into a complicated order delivered in rapid-fire fashion like he was testing her ability to keep up. Egg white omelette with vegetables, but only organic vegetables if they had them, which he clearly doubted. Whole grain toast, but only if it was actually whole grain. Fresh squeezed orange juice, which he somehow knew they didn't have, his tone making it clear that every limitation of the diner was a personal failing on her part. His associates ordered regular coffee with obvious embarrassment, avoiding eye contact with Maya, in that way people did when they were uncomfortable with how someone else was treating service workers, and she wrote everything down without comment because she needed the tips and couldn't afford to react. Maya put their order in and moved on to her other table, but she could hear Marcus holding court in the corner booth, his voice deliberately loud as he explained to his associates about his newest acquisition, some tech startup he'd purchased for pocket change and planned to strip for parts, using terminology designed to impress and exclude anyone without an MBA. The other customers had gone back to their meals, but there was a tension in the air now, the comfortable atmosphere of the diner disrupted by the presence of someone who was performing his wealth like a weapon. When Maya brought their food, Marcus examined his omelette with theatrical suspicion, poking at it with his fork and announcing to his companions that he couldn't even tell if these vegetables were organic, implying that the kitchen was probably trying to poison him with pesticide. She refilled their water glasses without comment, her face carefully neutral, counting down the minutes until they would leave and she could return to her regular customers who treated her like a human being. But Marcus wasn't done. He was just getting started, working himself up to something that Maya would later realize had been his intention all along, the reason he'd chosen this particular diner for this particular meeting, because men like Marcus Ashworth III didn't do anything without a purpose. It started when Maya brought the check and Marcus made a show of examining it like he was reviewing a contract, his manicured fingers holding the slip of paper at arm's length, while he announced to his associates that he couldn't believe they charged $6 for an omelette, that he spent more on his morning espresso at the cafe in his office building. His tone was light, joking, but there was an edge to it that Maya recognized from years of dealing with customers who used humor as a socially acceptable way to be cruel, and she maintained her smile and asked if there was a problem with his meal. Marcus looked directly at her for the first time since she'd taken their order, really looked at her, taking in the coffee stains on her uniform and the worn fabric at the elbows and the name tag that had been reused so many times the letters were barely visible, and something shifted in his expression that Maya couldn't quite read. He asked her how much she made, just like that, no preamble or context, and when she politely declined to answer he pressed, estimating that she probably pulled in maybe $30,000 a year if she was lucky, less than he spent on car insurance. His associates shifted uncomfortably but didn't intervene, and Maya felt heat rising in her face, the professional mask she wore starting to crack as Marcus continued, asking if she'd ever considered that maybe she was poor because she hadn't tried hard enough, hadn't developed valuable skills, hadn't made better life choices. The diner had gone completely silent now, every customer watching the scene unfold with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car crash, and Maya stood frozen beside their booth while Marcus warmed to his theme, explaining his personal philosophy that poverty was essentially a choice, that anyone with enough ambition and work ethic could succeed, that people who worked service jobs were there because they lacked the intelligence or drive to do better. He said it all with a smile, with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced a single consequence in his entire privileged life, and Maya felt something inside her snap like a worn rubber band stretched too far. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene, just looked Marcus Ashworth III directly in his self-satisfied face and asked him a simple question. Did he know what it felt like to work 16-hour days and still not have enough money to buy your daughter new shoes? Marcus blinked, clearly not expecting resistance, and opened his mouth to respond, but Maya kept going, her voice steady and cold as she described her actual life in clinical detail, the 2 jobs and the mounting debt and the meals she skipped so Daniela could eat, the calculations she ran constantly in her head about which bills could be paid late without devastating consequences. She told him about the warehouse shift where she packed boxes for minimum wage after working a full day at the diner, about her mother's insulin that she had to ration because they couldn't afford the prescribed dosage, about the apartment that was too small and too expensive but the only one that would rent to someone with her credit score. Marcus had stopped smiling now, his face flushing as he realized that everyone in the diner was staring at him with expressions ranging from disgust to outright hostility, his associates actively cringing in their seats as Maya dismantled his entire worldview with calm precision. She told him that she worked harder in a single day than he probably had in his entire life, that her labor had value even if people like him refused to acknowledge it, that poverty wasn't a moral failing but a systematic result of an economy designed to extract maximum value from workers while paying them minimum compensation. The words poured out of her in a torrent she couldn't stop. years of swallowed anger and suppressed exhaustion finally finding voice, and when she finished there was absolute silence in the diner except for the hiss of the grill and the buzz of the fluorescent lights over. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody in the diner knew until much later, was that Margaret Chen had been recording the entire interaction on her phone from her seat at the counter. The retired school teacher who'd taught herself to use technology in her 70s and had a surprisingly large following on her social media accounts where she documented daily life in their neighborhood. She'd started recording when Marcus first walked in, because something about his demeanor had set off alarm bells, decades of teaching having given her an instinct for identifying bullies, and she'd captured every word of his condescending speech and Maya's devastating response in crystal clear video. Margaret didn't say anything to Maya as the waitress walked away from Marcus's booth with her head held high, didn't announce what she was doing, as she quickly edited the video and uploaded it to 3 different platforms with the caption "Billionaire. Marcus Ashworth learns what real work looks like." But within minutes the first shares started appearing. The video spread through social media like wildfire catching dry brush, people sharing it with comments ranging from supportive to righteously angry, the algorithm picking it up and pushing it to millions of feeds, because nothing performed better than authentic conflict between the wealthy and working class. Maya knew none of this as she continued her shift, moving through her remaining tables on autopilot, while trying to process what had just happened, the adrenaline still coursing through her system making her hands shake as she poured coffee. Marcus and his associates left 20 minutes later without leaving a tip, his face carefully blank but his ears red with suppressed anger, and the moment the door closed behind them, the entire diner erupted in applause and supportive shouts that made Maya's eyes burn with tears she refused to let fall. She made it through the rest of her shift running on fumes and the encouragement of her regular customers. Bill, the construction worker, leaving her a $50 tip with a note that said "for telling truth to power," Margaret giving her a fierce hug and whispering that she was proud of her, even Tommy emerging from behind the grill to pat her shoulder awkwardly and tell her she handled that well. It wasn't until Maya's break at 1:30, when she finally checked her phone, that she saw the 57 missed calls and hundreds of text messages, her social media notifications exploding faster than she could process them. The video had been viewed 3 million times, shared by celebrities and politicians and regular people who saw their own struggles reflected in her words, comments flooding in with stories of similar experiences and expressions of support from strangers around the world. Maya sat in the diner's back office staring at her phone screen in disbelief, watching herself tell off a billionaire over and over in shaky footage that had somehow become a cultural moment, and she didn't know whether to laugh or cry or scream. Someone had identified Marcus Ashworth within the first hour, tech bloggers and business journalists pulling up information about his companies and his net worth and his history of controversial statements, building a narrative of an out-of-touch billionaire getting his comeuppance from an ordinary worker. The responses were overwhelmingly supportive of Maya, working mothers and service industry workers and anyone who'd ever been dismissed by someone wealthy sharing their own experience. But there were also the inevitable trolls and contrarians claiming the video was staged or that Maya was being entitled or that she should be grateful to even have a job. Maya refreshed the page and watched the view count climb to 4 million, 5 million, 6 million, the numbers becoming meaningless in their enormity. And somewhere in the chaos she realized that her life had just fundamentally changed in ways she couldn't begin to predict. The media descended on Maya's life like locusts on a field, reporters calling the diner and showing up at her apartment building and somehow finding her mother's phone number, all of them wanting interviews and statements and her reaction to the reaction, turning her moment of honest anger into content to be analyzed and monetized. She didn't go to her warehouse shift that night, calling in sick for the first time in 2 years, instead sitting at her kitchen table trying to process the surreal reality that millions of strangers had watched her worst day and decided to make her their symbol of something. The news coverage was overwhelming, major outlets picking up the story with headlines like "Working Mother Destroys Billionaire's Poverty Myth" and "Viral Video Exposes Class Divide in America." Think pieces appearing within hours analyzing what the moment meant for labor rights and wealth inequality and the culture wars. Maya's phone didn't stop ringing, producers from morning shows and podcasts and YouTube channels all wanting her story, publicists reaching out to offer representation, even a literary agent suggesting she write a book about her experience. She turned off her phone eventually, the constant notifications making it impossible to think, and just sat in the silence of her apartment trying to remember who she'd been 48 hours ago before any of this happened. Tommy called her on her mother's phone around 9, his voice gruff but concerned, telling her that the diner had been mobbed all day with people coming to see where that video was filmed, that he'd had to hire security to keep reporters from harassing his staff, that Maya should take a few days off until things calmed down. She appreciated the gesture but couldn't afford to miss work, the rent was still due, and Daniela still needed to eat, and viral fame didn't pay bills. But Tommy surprised her by mentioning that several customers had called, asking how they could help Maya direct, wanting to know if there was a fund or something they could contribute to. That night Maya discovered that someone had set up a crowdfunding campaign for her without permission, a GoFundMe page with the title Help Maya the Diner Warrior, that had already raised $40,000 from thousands of individual donations, strangers sending $5 or $10 or $20 with messages of support and gratitude. She stared at the number in disbelief, more money than she made in a year appearing overnight from people she'd never met, the comments section full of stories from other working people who saw themselves in her struggle. The attention wasn't all positive though. Conservative commentators and business advocates pushing back against the narrative, arguing that Maya was entitled or ungrateful, that she should have been more respectful to a customer regardless of his behavior, that the real problem was her lack of ambition, not the economic system. Marcus Ashworth himself released a statement through his PR team, a carefully worded non-apology that expressed surprise that his friendly conversation had been misinterpreted, suggesting that the video was taken out of context and that he'd actually been trying to offer Maya career advice. His statement was immediately torn apart by the same internet that had elevated Maya, people posting screenshots of his previous controversial comments about poor people and workers' rights, digging up stories about labor violations at his companies and his opposition to minimum wage increases, building a case against him that went far beyond one interaction at a diner. By Friday morning, the crowdfunding campaign had passed $100,000 and 3 separate lawyers had offered to represent Maya pro bono if she wanted to pursue any legal action, though against what or whom remained unclear since Marcus hadn't technically done anything illegal. Maya finally turned her phone back on and scrolled through hundreds of messages, some from old friends she hadn't spoken to in years, some from advocacy organizations wanting her to speak at events, some from regular people just wanting to tell her she wasn't alone, and she felt overwhelmed by the weight of all these expectations from strangers who'd decided she represented something larger than herself. Marcus Ashworth's week went from bad to catastrophic as the video continued spreading and people started connecting dots, that his PR team desperately tried to obscure, journalists digging into his business practices and finding pattern after pattern of exactly the attitude he'd displayed at the diner, writ large across his corporate empire. It started with his employees, workers from 3 different companies he owned, recording their own videos describing the conditions they worked under, the mandatory overtime without proper compensation, the health insurance that covered almost nothing, the culture of fear and intimidation that punished anyone who complained or tried to organize. The floodgates opened and suddenly Marcus was facing not just social media backlash, but actual consequences, major clients announcing they were severing relationships with his company, citing values misalignment and public pressure from their own customers who refused to support businesses that supported him. His board of directors held an emergency meeting on Saturday morning, the kind of meeting where everyone avoided eye contact and spoke in careful euphemisms about market conditions and brand reputation, and by noon Marcus had been asked to step down from operational leadership of the company he'd inherited from his father. He tried to control the narrative, giving an interview to a friendly journalist, where he positioned himself as the victim of cancel culture and mob mentality, but the interview only made things worse when he couldn't help slipping back into the same condescending language that had started the whole mess, referring to his critics as uninformed and suggesting that people who didn't understand business should refrain from commenting on it. The video of that interview spawned a whole new wave of criticism, and the hashtag that had been tracking the story climbed to #1 worldwide. Millions of people sharing their own experiences with employers or wealthy individuals who viewed workers as disposable resources, rather than human beings. Meanwhile, Maya was dealing with her own whirlwind, the crowdfunding campaign passing $300,000 and showing no signs of slowing, lawyers and financial advisors volunteering their services to help her manage the sudden influx of money and attention. She'd finally agreed to do one interview, a local news station that had covered labor issues before and approached her with respect, rather than sensationalism, and she found herself sitting under studio lights trying to explain that she hadn't meant to start a movement. She'd just been tired and angry, and finally unable to keep silent. The interviewer asked her what she wanted to say to Marcus Ashworth, and Maya paused, thinking about the man who'd walked into her diner with such casual contempt, and said that she didn't want his apology or his money. She wanted him to understand that every person working every job deserved dignity and fair compensation, that the economy he benefited from was built on the backs of people like her, who worked themselves to exhaustion for wages that barely covered survival. She talked about the other waitresses at Mel's and the warehouse workers she knew, and the single mothers juggling 3 jobs, and the elderly people choosing between medication and food, painting a picture of an America that existed parallel to Marcus's world of luxury and excess, but might as well have been on a different planet for all the connection between them. The interview went viral, Maya's calm sincerity and obvious exhaustion creating a stark contrast to Marcus's defensive anger, and by Monday morning the story had evolved beyond the initial confrontation into a larger conversation about wealth inequality and labor rights and the growing divide between the executive class and everyone else. Marcus's companies lost 17% of their stock value in 3 days, advertisers pulling their support, business partners reconsidering their relationships, the kind of financial consequence that actually mattered to people who measured their worth in dollars. On Tuesday morning, Marcus released a second statement, this one without the PR polish, a video filmed in what looked like his home office, where he actually appeared human for the first time, admitting that he'd been wrong and insensitive and blind to the realities that most Americans face, though whether his remorse was genuine or strategic remained open to interpretation. 3 months after the video went viral, Maya Rodriguez walked into the office of a non-profit organization dedicated to workers' rights and fair labor practices, not as a client or someone looking for help, but as their newly hired director of community outreach, a position created specifically for her using a combination of foundation grants and donations that had poured in after her story became national news. The crowdfunding campaign had ultimately raised over $600,000, enough that Maya had paid off every medical bill and debt she owed, set up a college fund for Daniela, bought reliable transportation, and still had enough left over to breathe for the first time in years, without the constant panic of mathematical impossibility. She'd quit both the diner and the warehouse, not in anger but with gratitude for the jobs that had kept her afloat while she figured out how to swim, and Tommy had thrown her a goodbye party where the regular customers had presented her with a framed photo of herself mid-confrontation with Marcus, capturing the exact moment she'd stopped performing deference and started speaking truth. The new job paid $45,000 a year with actual benefits and reasonable hours, and the opportunity to help other people navigate the same systems that had nearly crushed her, using her experience and sudden platform to advocate for the workers who didn't have millions of witnesses to their daily struggles. Maya spent her days meeting with labor organizers and workers' groups, sharing her story at union halls and community centers, helping to organize campaigns for better wages and working conditions, turning her viral moment into sustained action rather than just fleeting internet fame. Marcus Ashworth had largely disappeared from public view, remaining on his company's board, but with no operational authority, his social media accounts deleted, and his public appearances carefully managed by an entirely new PR team focused on damage control. He'd made substantial donations to several workers' advocacy organizations, in what was widely viewed as an attempt to buy back some reputation, though whether the money came with any genuine change of perspective was known only to him and perhaps the therapist his board had reportedly insisted he see. The diner had become something of a landmark, tourists and locals stopping by to see where that video happened. Tommy capitalizing on the attention by hanging Maya's photo behind the register and creating a special menu item called the Maya that donated $1 from each order to workers' rights organizations. Daniela was thriving in her new school, one with better resources and smaller class sizes, no longer asking her mother why she always looked so tired or why they couldn't afford things other kids had, and Maya had started sleeping through the night for the first time in years, without the constant anxiety of impossible mathematics. On the first Thursday after starting her new job, Maya drove to Mel's during her lunch break, and found Mr. Chen in his usual booth reading his newspaper, and when he looked up and saw her, his face broke into the warmest smile she'd ever seen from him. She slid into the seat across from him without asking permission, and he closed his newspaper, and they talked for 45 minutes about everything and nothing, about his daughter who he'd lost to cancer 5 years ago and who'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to afford treatment, about Maya's plans for her new position and his quiet pride in watching her transform pain into purpose. He told her that he'd always left generous tips not out of pity but out of recognition, seeing in her the same fierce determination his daughter had possessed, the same refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have crushed someone with less strength, and Maya finally understood why his attention had always felt different from other customers. When she left the diner that afternoon, Maya didn't feel like a viral sensation or a symbol or a representative of working America. She just felt like herself, someone who'd survived impossible circumstances through sheer stubborn endurance, and had somehow found a way to turn survival into something resembling actual living. And as she drove to pick up Daniela from a school that didn't require financial aid, applications and judgment, she let herself believe that maybe things could actually be different, not perfect but better, not easy but possible, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future looked like something other than just more of the same exhausting present stretched infinitely forward.